In the unforgiving Montana Territory of 1874, survival was a luxury, and love was a fable no one could afford. Eliza Sutton was just a seamstress with bleeding fingers and a mountain of debt, forcing her into a marriage of convenience with the town's most terrified myth, a scarred, silent mountain man named Gideon. Everyone in Last Chance whispered that he was a beast who had lost his mind in the winter snows. They were wrong. He wasn't a beast. He was a king in exile. And by the time Eliza found the gun with the golden crest buried under the floorboards, it was already too late to run. The bell above the door of Sutton's Tailoring and Repair jingled not with the cheerful promise of a customer, but with the ominous rattle of judgment. Eliza Sutton didn't look up from the grey wool trouser leg she was hemming. She knew that heavy, uneven gait. She knew the smell of stale cigar smoke and expensive bay rum that wafted in, choking the scent of lavender she used to keep the shop fresh. "Mr. Galt," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She pushed the needle through the thick fabric. "You are early. The payment isn't due until Friday." Phineas Galt, the banker of Last Chance, Montana, leaned his bulk against the counter. He was a man who wore his greed like a waistcoat, tight and straining at the buttons. He placed a gloved hand on the polished wood, his fingers tapping a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. "Friday is a concept, Miss Sutton," Galt sneered. "Solvency is a reality, and looking at your ledger—" He reached over, flipping the book open without permission. "It seems reality is coming for you. Your father's medical debts remain. The mortgage on this shop remains. And patience, well, that has run dry." Eliza finally looked up. Her eyes were green, sharp, and tired. She was 22, but the last 2 years of nursing a dying father and fighting off bankruptcy had aged her spirit, if not her face. "I have the order for the sheriff's new coat. I have 3 dresses for Mrs. Higgins. I will have the money." "Small change," Galt dismissed. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a greasy whisper. "There is, of course, another way. I've been a widower for a year now. I have a large house. I need a woman to manage it. You are plain, perhaps, but sturdy. Sell the shop to me for the debt, come live at my estate, and we wash the slate clean." It wasn't a proposal. It was an ultimatum. Become his servant, or worse, or starve in the street. "I would rather freeze," Eliza said, cold. Galt's face reddened. "Winter is coming, Eliza, and it's going to be a hard one. You have until Friday noon. After that, I take the shop." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard a jar of buttons rattled off the shelf and shattered. Eliza stared at the spilled buttons, mother-of-pearl bone brass, scattered like her future. She dropped to her knees to gather them, fighting back tears. Tears didn't pay debts. It was then she saw the boots. They were massive, caked in dried mud and old snow made of bear hide. She froze her hand, hovering over a blue button. She looked up past the worn canvas trousers, past the heavy buffalo coat that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, up to the face of the man standing in the shadows of the corner. She hadn't heard him enter. It was the man they called the Ghost of Granite Peak. Some called him Gideon. No last name. He came down from the high mountains only twice a year to trade furs for ammunition and salt. He was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with hair long and matted like a lion's mane, and a beard that hid half his face. The half that was visible was marred by a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw, pulling his lip into a permanent grimace. He was holding a torn fur coat. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor. "Can you fix it?" His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting underground. It sounded unused rusty. Eliza stood, dusting off her apron. Most women in town crossed the street when Gideon walked by. He was rumored to have killed men with his bare hands. But Eliza saw something else. She saw the way he held the coat gently. "I can," she said. She took the coat. It was heavy, good quality, but ripped by what looked like a claw. "It will cost $2. He nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small pouch. He dropped 2 gold coins on the counter. Far more than $2. "Keep the change," he grumbled, turning to leave. "Wait," Eliza said. The desperation in her chest suddenly sparked into a wild, terrifying idea. A madness born of fear. Gideon stopped his hand on the doorframe. He didn't turn around. "Mr. Gideon." She started, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You live alone?" "Up on the ridge." He turned his head slightly. The scar shone white in the dim light. "I do." Do you need a wife?" The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush her. Gideon turned fully, then his dark eyes narrowing beneath heavy brows. He looked at her as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue. "I am not looking for company," he rasped. "Not for company." Eliza stepped forward, her hands clenched in her skirt. "For work, I can cook, I can skin game, I can sew better than anyone in the territory, and I need to leave town. Today." He studied her. For a moment, the savage look in his eyes softened into something analytical, almost intelligent, before vanishing behind the mask of the brute again. "Why?" "Phineas Galt wants to own me," she said bluntly. "I have debts. If I am married, the law says my debts are my husband's responsibility, or that my property cannot be seized as easily. I don't know the law perfectly, but I know he won't challenge a man like you." Gideon let out a short, harsh sound. It might have been a laugh. "You think I have money to pay your debts, little bird?" "No," she said. "I think Galt is terrified of you. Everyone is. If I am your wife, he won't come near me." Gideon looked at the gold coins on the counter. He looked at Eliza, her pale face, her shaking hands, the defiant tilt of her chin. He saw a creature caught in a trap, gnawing at its own leg to get free. He knew that feeling. "It's a hard life," he said, his voice dropping. "Cold. Lonely. I have nothing to offer a woman. No silks, no parties." "I don't want parties," Eliza whispered. "I want safety." Gideon stepped closer. He towered over her. He smelled of the pool of deep forests and blood. He took off his glove, revealing a hand that was rough, calloused, but surprisingly clean. "Pack your things," he said. "We leave in the hour, before the snow starts." The ascent to Granite Peak was not a journey. It was an ordeal. Eliza had packed her life into 2 carpet bags. Her sewing machine, her livelihood, was strapped awkwardly to the back of Gideon's mule, a stubborn creature named Jasper. They had visited the preacher in a whirlwind of confusion. The Reverend had looked from the trembling seamstress to the towering mountain man with sheer horror stuttering through the vows. Gideon had signed the register with a simple X, though Eliza noticed he held the pen with a strange, practiced elegance before making the crude mark. Now, hours later, the town of Last Chance was a speck in the valley below. The air grew thin and bit at Eliza's lungs. The pine trees, initially sparse, became a dense, dark wall of green and black. Gideon walked ahead, leading the mule. He didn't speak. He didn't look back to see if she was keeping up. He moved with a deceptive speed, his limp vanishing as the terrain grew rougher, as if the mountain was the only place his body understood. Eliza's boots, made for town sidewalks, slipped on the icy shale. She gasped, sliding backward, but before she could fall, a hand caught her arm. It was Gideon. He hadn't even turned his body, just reached back with impossible reflexes. His grip was iron, yet he didn't bruise her. He hauled her upright and released her instantly. "Watch the loose rock," he muttered. "Thank you," she panted. "How much farther?" He pointed upward. "The cloud line." They climbed until the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and blood orange. Finally, the trees broke, revealing a small plateau nestled against a sheer cliff face. There sat the cabin. It was not the hovel she expected. It was built of massive hand-hewn logs, chinked perfectly with mud and moss. A stone chimney smoked lazily into the twilight. There was a woodshed, a smokehouse, and a small corral. It was sturdy. It was permanent. "Home," Gideon said. Inside the cabin was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. But what shocked Eliza was the interior. It was Spartan, yes, but incredibly organized. There were no piles of dirty furs or rotting food. The floor was swept clean, and in the corner, a large bookshelf stood filled with leather-bound books. Eliza walked toward them, her fingers itching to touch the spines. Shakespeare, Plato, a treatise on civil engineering, the Holy Bible. "You can read?" she asked, turning to him. Gideon was busy hanging his coat. He stiffened. "They were here when I found the place," he lied. The lie was smooth, but his eyes shifted away. "Firewood needs fetching." He grabbed an axe and vanished back outside. Eliza looked around the room that was now her prison and her sanctuary. There was only one bed, a large frame made of pine with a thick feather mattress. She swallowed hard. They were married. The reality of what that meant began to settle in her stomach like cold lead. She set to work. If she was to be his wife, she would earn her keep. She unpacked her meager food supplies, dried apples, a sack of flour, some coffee. She found a cast-iron skillet and began to prepare a simple supper. When Gideon returned, stomping the snow off his boots, the cabin smelled of baking biscuits and frying bacon. He stopped in the doorway, the scent hitting him like a physical blow. For a second, a look of profound, agonizing longing crossed his face, a look of a man remembering a life dead and buried. He composed himself and sat at the rough table. Eliza placed a plate before him. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the wind howling outside, testing the walls. "Where do I sleep?" Eliza asked when the plates were cleared. Gideon stood and walked to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. He pulled out a thick buffalo robe and a wool blanket. He threw them onto the rug in front of the fire. "Take the bed," he said gruffly. "I sleeps here." Eliza blinked. "But we are married." Gideon looked at her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his scarred face. "You married me for safety, Eliza, not for this." He gestured vaguely between them. "I am a broken thing. You are here because you had nowhere else to go. I will not touch you." He lay down on the rug, turning his back to her. Eliza climbed into the large bed. The sheets were flannel, surprisingly soft. She lay awake for hours, listening to the breathing of the stranger on the floor. Who was he? A man who signed with an X but owned Plato. A man who lived like a savage but kept his home with military precision. Days turned into weeks. The routine was brutal but rhythmic. Gideon checked his trap lines at dawn. Eliza cooked, cleaned, and sewed. She took the torn clothes he brought back, furs and rough canvas, and mended them with intricate, beautiful stitches. One afternoon, while Gideon was out, Eliza decided to clean the loft where he stored the cured pelts. It was dusty, filled with the smell of musk. As she moved a stack of beaver skins, she knocked over a loose floorboard near the chimney. Below the board, tucked into the insulation, was a small velvet-wrapped bundle. Curiosity, that dangerous thing, took hold of her. She checked the window. Gideon was miles away. She unwrapped the velvet. Inside was a silver pocket watch, its glass cracked, and a heavy signet ring. The ring was gold engraved with a crest, a lion rampant holding a hammer. She opened the watch. On the inside of the casing, an inscription was etched in elegant cursive. To William, so you may always find your way home. Love, Mother. 1868. William, she whispered. Suddenly the door downstairs slammed open. The wind roared in, followed by the heavy thud of boots. Eliza! Gideon's voice boomed, sounding panicked. She frantically wrapped the bundle and shoved it back under the board, smoothing the furs over it. She scrambled down the ladder, her heart racing. Gideon was standing by the table, breathing hard. He looked at her, his eyes scanning her face. "Storm is coming," he said, his voice tight. "A blizzard. We need to board the windows." He didn't know she had found it. But Eliza looked at the man she called Gideon, the man with the scar and the limp, and knew the truth. Gideon wasn't just a trapper. He was William. And whoever William was, he was hiding from something far more dangerous than a banker with a grudge. That night the storm hit. It buried the cabin in 6 feet of snow, trapping them inside. And in the close, suffocating heat of the fire, the secrets between them began to unravel. The blizzard did not just arrive. It assaulted the mountain. For 3 days, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming wall of white that buried the windows and piled snow against the door until the wood groaned under the weight. Inside the cabin became a capsule of suspended time. The air grew thick and intimate. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from each other. On the second night of the storm, the dynamic shifted. Gideon, usually a statue of stoic endurance, collapsed. He had been chopping wood near the hearth, his movements jerky and agitated. Suddenly the axe slipped from his hand, clattering onto the stone. He staggered, gripping the mantelpiece, his knuckles turning white. "Gideon!" Eliza looked up from her sewing. He didn't answer. He swayed, then crumpled to the floor with a heavy thud that shook the floorboards. Eliza dropped her needle and rushed to him. When she touched his forehead, her hand recoiled. He was burning up. His skin was dry and hot like parchment left too close to a flame. "The cold," he muttered, his teeth chattering violently. "It gets in the bones." It wasn't just the cold. It was the mountain fever, or perhaps an infection from old wounds, agitating in the damp pressure of the storm. Eliza knew she couldn't lift him to the bed. He was dead weight, sheer muscle and bone. She dragged the buffalo robes and blankets from the bed, piling them over him on the rug. She stoked the fire until the hearth roared. But he wouldn't stop shivering. "No," he groaned, thrashing under the furs. "Not the furnace, too hot. Father, look out." Eliza froze. "Furnace." She knelt beside him, dipping a rag into a basin of snowmelt water. She wiped his brow. The scar on his face was livid purple against his flushed skin. "It's all right," she whispered. "You're safe. You're in the cabin." "They locked the doors." Gideon gasped, his eyes flying open. But he wasn't seeing her. He was seeing a hellscape from years ago. The vents. Blocked. The pressure. William, run! He grabbed Eliza's wrist. His grip was bruising. I couldn't save them. I tried to turn the valve. The steam, it took the skin. Eliza didn't pull away. She realized then that the scars on his face and body were not from a bear or a cougar. They were burns. Scalding terrible burns from steam or fire. Hush now, she soothed, using her free hand to stroke his matted hair. Sleep, William. The name acted like a spell. His grip loosened. His eyes lost focus, drifting shut. William is dead, he whispered, a tear leaking from the corner of his eye, tracking through the dirt on his cheek. Only the monster is left. For 2 days, Eliza was his nurse. She forced willow bark tea between his cracked lips. She changed the cold compresses. She washed his face, trimming the beard that he usually used as a shield, revealing a strong, square jawline beneath the coarse hair. He was a handsome man, she realized with a start. Beneath the trauma and the grime, there was a nobility to his features, a Roman nose, high cheekbones. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. The silence was deafening. Eliza fell asleep, sitting against the hearthstones, exhausted. She woke to the smell of coffee. She blinked open her eyes. Gideon was sitting at the table. He was pale gaunt, but steady. He had shaved the rest of his beard, leaving only heavy stubble. The scar was exposed, but he no longer seemed to care to hide it. You called me William, he said. He didn't look at her. He stared into his tin cup. Eliza sat up, her body aching from the hard floor. You spoke in your sleep. I said many things, I imagine. You spoke of a furnace, of locked doors. She stood and smoothed her apron, trying to regain her dignity. And I found the watch, under the floorboards, before the storm. Gideon slowly turned his head. His dark eyes locked onto hers. There was no anger, only a profound weariness. Curiosity kills the cat, Eliza. But satisfaction brought it back, she countered, quoting the old rhyme. Who are you really? A man doesn't hide on a mountain because he's shy. He hides because he's hunted. Gideon sighed, a sound that seemed to rattle deep in his chest. I am not hunted by the law, if that is what you fear. I am hunted by memories, and by a family that would prefer me dead. He stood and walked to the window, scraping a small hole in the frost to look out at the blinding white world. My name is William Vanderveer. My father owned the Vanderveer Steelworks in Pittsburgh. Eliza gasped. Vanderveer Steel was legendary. It was one of the pillars of American industry, supplying the rails for the transcontinental lines. 3 years ago, Gideon continued, his voice flat, there was an accident at the main foundry. A pressure valve failed. I was the foreman that day. I was supposed to check it. I didn't. The explosion killed 12 men. It burned half my body. He touched his face. My father. He couldn't have a crippled, scarred son as the face of the company. It was bad for business. Bad for the stock prices. He declared me dead in the accident. He gave me money, a train ticket, and told me to disappear. He said if I ever used the name Vanderveer again, he'd have me committed to an asylum for the insane. Eliza felt a cold horror seep into her bones. He banished you. His own son. I killed those men, Eliza, Gideon said, turning to her. The self-hatred in his voice was a physical weight. I deserve this exile. I deserve to be a ghost. Eliza crossed the room. She didn't think. She simply acted. She took his large, rough hand in hers. "You are not a ghost," she said fiercely. "You are a man who survived. You are a man who saved me from Phineas Galt. You are a man who chops wood and quotes Plato and feels pain. That is not a ghost. That is a husband." Gideon looked at their joined hands. For the first time since she had met him, the hard lines of his mouth softened. He lifted her hand, hesitating before pressing his lips to her knuckles. His lips were chapped, but the touch sent a shock-wave through Eliza's body. "I am a dangerous man to know Eliza Sutton," he whispered. "I am Eliza Vanderveer," she corrected him, "and I have survived poverty and winter. I can survive you." The thaw came with a deceptive gentleness. The sun turned the snowdrifts into slush, and the sound of dripping water replaced the howling wind. The pass down to Last Chance was open again. Life in the cabin had changed. There was a tentative peace. Gideon Eliza still called him that, for William felt like a ghost's name no longer slept on the floor. They shared the bed, though he stayed on his edge, rigid and respectful. But the conversations flowed. He spoke of the operas in New York. She spoke of the small gossips of Last Chance. They were building a bridge across the chasm of their pasts. Eliza began to transform the cabin. She used spare fabric to make curtains. She swept the soot. She even trimmed Gideon's hair, revealing the distinguished aristocrat beneath the wild man. But peace in the West is rarely long-lived. 2 weeks after the storm, Jasper the mule brayed loudly in the corral, a warning sound. Gideon was cleaning his rifle on the porch. He froze, then immediately racked the lever, loading a round into the chamber. "Inside," he commanded, his voice snapping back to the drill sergeant tone of their early days. "Get under the floorboards." "What?" Eliza was churning butter near the door. "Riders! 2 of them, moving fast. Not locals." Eliza didn't argue. She knew the tone. She scrambled up the ladder to the loft, hiding behind the stack of furs, peering through a crack in the wood. Gideon stayed on the porch, the rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. He leaned against the post, his face a mask of indifference. 2 riders emerged from the tree line. They were not wearing the rough wool of miners or trappers. They wore long black canvas dusters and flat-brimmed hats. Their horses were high-blooded bays, breathing hard from the climb. The lead rider slowed his horse and tipped his hat. He was a man with a face like a hatchet, sharp, thin, and cruel. His eyes scanned the cabin, the corral, and finally rested on Gideon. "Morning," the stranger said. His accent was clipped Eastern. "Morning," Gideon replied. He didn't lower the rifle. "Lost your way?" Gideon asked. "Not lost," the man said, dismounting smoothly. He kept his hands away from the pistol at his hip, but the threat was there. "Tracing a rumor, looking for a man." "Lots of men in these mountains," Gideon grunted. "Most don't want to be found." The stranger pulled a folded paper from his pocket. He shook it open. It was a sketch. It was crude, but the likeness was undeniable. It was William Vanderveer, pre-accident. "Looking for a William Vanderveer," the stranger said. "Heir to the Pittsburgh steel fortune. Disappeared 3 years back. His father passed away last month. Turns out the old man didn't write him out of the will as effectively as the board of directors hoped. There's a lot of money at stake." Gideon's expression didn't flicker. "Don't know him." The stranger smiled, a thin stretching of lips. "You fit the height, the build. Though the face, well, the fire would change a man. I said I don't know him." Gideon repeated his voice, dropping an octave. "I'm Gideon, trapper. Lived here 5 years." "Is that so?" The stranger took a step toward the porch. "Mind if we look around? Maybe ask your companion." He nodded toward the window where Eliza's new curtains hung. A woman's touch, rare up here. You step on this porch, you die, Gideon said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. The second rider's hand hovered over his gun. Suddenly the cabin door creaked open. Eliza stepped out. She had rubbed flour on her face to pale it and messed her hair. She held a dirty wooden spoon in one hand, looking every bit the harried frontier wife. "Gideon!" she screeched, her voice shrill and grating. "You gonna stand there jawing with strangers while the stew burns? I told you to fetch water an hour ago, you lazy mule." She looked at the strangers and spat on the ground. "What do you want selling Bibles we don't read?" The stranger blinked, taken aback. He looked from the scarred, menacing giant to the shrill, dirty woman. This was not the scene of a hiding aristocrat. This was common mountain squalor. "Just asking directions, ma'am," the stranger said, his lip curling in distaste. He looked back at Gideon. The resemblance was there, but the context was all wrong. A Vanderveer would never live like this. A Vanderveer would never marry that. Granite Peak is that way. Gideon pointed with his chin. "Now get. My wife gets cranky when she's hungry." The stranger stared at Gideon for a long, uncomfortable minute. Then he slowly folded the paper. "My apologies," he said. "Must be the wrong mountain." He mounted his horse. "Let's go, Mr. Rourke," he called to his companion. They turned and rode back down the trail. Gideon didn't move until they were out of sight. Then he sagged against the post, letting out a long breath. Eliza dropped the act instantly. She walked to him, wiping the flour from her cheek. "His father is dead," she said softly. Gideon looked at her, his eyes haunted. "Yes, and you are the heir." "I am the heir to a kingdom of ashes," he replied bitterly. "Those men, they weren't lawyers, Eliza. They were cleaners. If they had confirmed who I was, they would have killed us both and burned this cabin to the ground to secure the company for the board members." He turned to her, gripping her shoulders. "You are in danger. Real danger now. Galt was a nuisance. These men represent millions of dollars. They will come back. They will check records in town. They will find out I married a seamstress named Sutton. They will put the pieces together." "Then what do we do?" Eliza asked, her chin trembling, but her eyes fierce. Gideon looked toward the horizon. "We can't stay here. We have to run. Or. His face hardened into a look of cold determination. The look of the titan of industry he was born to be. "Or we go back. We go to Pittsburgh. We walk into the boardroom, and I take what is mine. But they will kill you." "Not if I have leverage," Gideon said. "And not if I have a witness." He looked at Eliza. "Phineas Galt." "Galt," Eliza frowned. "Why him?" "Because Galt is a greedy snake." Gideon smiled grimly. "And he keeps detailed records of everyone who passes through Last Chance. He might be the only man who can prove I've been here for 3 years and that I am alive. We need to go back to town. We need to make a deal with the devil." Eliza looked down the mountain toward the town she had fled. "Back to the lion's den?" "Yes," Gideon said, taking her hand. "But this time, the lion is with you." The descent into Last Chance was a funeral procession in reverse. Gideon and Eliza rode Jasper down the muddy switchbacks, the silence between them heavy with the weight of the gamble they were about to take. Gideon had changed. He wore his best coat, the one Eliza had mended, and he had polished his boots with grease. He didn't slouch. He sat tall in the saddle, his scarred face held high. He looked like a king returning to a rebellious province. They arrived in town just as the noon whistle blew from the lumber yard. The streets were churning with mud and wagons. People stopped to stare. They knew Eliza, the poor seamstress, and they knew the terrified whispers about the ghost of Granite Peak. Seeing them together riding tandem silenced the street. "Head high," Gideon murmured against her ear. "You are the wife of a Vanderveer. You own this town. They just don't know it yet." They didn't go to the sheriff. They went straight to the bank. Phineas Galt was behind the counter berating a young teller for an ink smudge when the door opened. The bell jingled. Galt looked up, his sneer ready. It froze when he saw Gideon. The mountain man filled the doorway, blocking out the light. "Mr. Galt," Eliza said, her voice ringing clear. "We need a moment of your time. Private." Galt's eyes darted to the heavy Bowie knife on Gideon's belt. The bank is closed for lunch." "Open it," Gideon said. His voice wasn't the rusty growl of the mountain anymore. It was the smooth, polished baritone of a boardroom predator. Galt swallowed and ushered them into his back office, closing the blinds. He sat behind his mahogany desk, trying to look important, but sweat beaded on his bald pate. "If this is about the mortgage, Eliza, I'm afraid the deadline has passed." "Quiet," Gideon commanded. He didn't sit. He walked to the wall where a map of the proposed railroad extension hung. He studied it for a moment, then turned to Galt. "You're buying B-grade iron rails from the Carnegie foundries for this spur. They'll crack in the winter frost. You'll lose your investment within 2 years." Galt blinked. "Excuse me. How would a trapper know about metallurgy?" Gideon leaned over the desk, placing his hands flat on the green leather blotter. "I am not a trapper, Phineas. My name is William Vanderveer, former vice president of Vanderveer Steel, and I am the man who designed the alloy you should be using." Galt laughed nervously. "Vanderveer, the dead heir. You're insane. You're the scarred freak from the ridge." "I am the man who controls the patent on the Bessemer process variation used in every rail west of the Mississippi," Gideon said coldly. "And right now, there are men in this town looking to kill me to ensure I stay dead. Men sent by my father's board of directors." Galt went pale. He knew the name Vanderveer. Everyone in finance did. It was money old enough to buy God. "Why tell me?" Galt whispered. "Because I need a witness," Gideon said. "I need a reputable man of business to sign an affidavit stating I have been alive and residing here for 3 years. I need you to wire the bank in Helena and confirm my identity using my mother's maiden name, Blackwell." "And why would I do that?" Galt's greed began to overcome his fear. "It sounds dangerous." "Because," Eliza stepped forward, "if you do, my husband will grant you the exclusive contract for the steel supply to the Montana rail line. You will be the richest man in the territory." Galt's eyes widened. He looked from Eliza to the scarred giant. He saw the truth. No trapper could fake that kind of authority. "The contract," Galt licked his lips. "In writing tools. Draft it," Gideon said. "Now." As Galt scrambled for paper and ink, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the main lobby of the bank. Gideon stiffened. He recognized the stride. "Galt," Gideon hissed. "Is there a back way?" Just the vault and the alley door, Galt stammered, dropping his pen. Get Eliza to the vault. Lock it. No. Eliza grabbed Gideon's arm. I am not leaving you. Eliza, please. Gideon's eyes were desperate. These men are professionals. I can't fight them if I'm worrying about you. The door to the office exploded inward. Splinters of wood sprayed the room. Gideon shoved Eliza behind the heavy oak desk just as the first bullet whizzed past his ear, shattering the glass of a portrait behind him. The man in the black duster, the one from the mountain, stepped through the ruin of the door, a smoking Colt Navy revolver in his hand. He was smiling. Found you, Mr. Vanderveer, the mercenary said. You were hard to track, but a giant riding a mule into town that draws the eye. The office was small, smelling of stale paper and fresh gunpowder. Galt shrieked and dove under his chair, clutching the unwritten contract to his chest like a shield. Gideon didn't panic. The explosion of violence had flipped a switch in his brain. He was no longer the mountain man, nor the businessman. He was the survivor who had walked out of a burning factory. He grabbed a heavy brass inkwell from the desk and hurled it with the force of a cannonball. The mercenary, whose name was Corcoran, ducked. The inkwell smashed into the doorframe, spraying black ink across his face and eyes. "Damn it!" Corcoran yelled, firing blindly. The bullet struck the desk, sending a shower of wood chips into Eliza's hair. She screamed, not in fear, but in rage. She saw the letter opener on the floor, dropped by Galt. She snatched it up. Gideon used the distraction to lunge. He didn't go for his gun. He was too close. He tackled Corcoran, driving him back into the bank lobby. The two men crashed through the teller's cage wire mesh, and wood collapsing around them. "Kill him!" Corcoran screamed to his partner, who was waiting by the front door. The second mercenary raised his rifle. Gideon was on top of Corcoran, his hands around the man's throat, but he was exposed. He saw the rifle barrel swing toward him. He had no time to move. Crack! The sound was sharp, different from the heavy boom of the revolver. The second mercenary jerked his rifle, firing into the ceiling. He grabbed his shoulder where a red blossom of blood appeared and fell backward against the window. Gideon looked back. Eliza stood in the doorway of the office. She was holding Galt's small pearl-handled derringer, the gentleman's gun he kept in his drawer. Smoke curled from the barrel. Her hands were shaking, but her aim had been true. "Don't," she gasped, "touch my husband." The distraction cost Gideon his advantage. Corcoran, blinded by ink and rage, kneed Gideon in the stomach and rolled him over. He pistol-whipped Gideon across the face. The scar tissue tore open. Blood blinded Gideon's right eye. Corcoran stood, panting, wiping ink and blood from his face. He leveled his gun at Gideon's chest. Gideon lay amidst the wreckage of the bank, gasping for air. "End of the line, rich boy," Corcoran sneered. "Board sends their regards." "Wait." The shout came from the floor of the office. Phineas Galt crawled out, waving a piece of paper. "You can't kill him," Galt squealed. "He hasn't signed the contract yet." The absurdity of the moment made Corcoran pause. He looked at the fat banker. "What if you kill him?" Galt stammered, finding a strange courage in his avarice. "I will testify. I have the telegrams drafted. I have the proof. You aren't killing a ghost anymore, you fool. You're killing William Vanderveer in front of witnesses in a federal bank. You'll hang." Corcoran hesitated. The plan relied on secrecy. A messy public murder of a known tycoon was not what he was paid for. Gideon saw the hesitation. He saw the split second where Corcoran calculated the risk. Gideon's hand found a shard of the broken teller's glass on the floor. With a roar that shook the dust from the rafters, Gideon surged upward. He didn't shoot. He slashed. The glass cut across Corcoran's wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. Gideon followed with a right cross, a punch honed by 5 years of chopping oak and breaking rock. It connected with Corcoran's jaw, with a sickening crunch. The mercenary spun and collapsed unconscious before he hit the floor. Silence fell over the bank. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light coming through the bullet holes. Gideon stood swaying. Blood dripped from his chin onto his fine coat. He looked at Eliza. She was still holding the derringer, her chest heaving. He walked to her, stepping over the debris. He gently took the gun from her fingers and set it on the counter. "You shot a man," he said, his voice full of wonder. "He was going to kill you," she whispered. Then the adrenaline crashed. Her knees buckled. Gideon caught her. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her neck. He didn't care about the blood. He didn't care about Galt watching them with his mouth open. "I have you," he murmured. "I have you." Sheriff Brady burst through the front doors a moment later, shotgun in hand, followed by half the town. They stopped staring at the carnage. The broken cage. The unconscious men. The bloodied giant holding the seamstress. "What in God's name happened here?" the sheriff bellowed. Gideon turned. He kept one arm around Eliza. He wiped the blood from his eye with his sleeve and looked at the sheriff, then at the townspeople. "Sheriff," Gideon said, his voice commanding the room, "arrest these men for attempted murder, and get a telegraph operator." "Who are you to give orders?" the sheriff asked, though he lowered his gun. Gideon straightened his spine. He looked at Eliza, and she nodded. "I am William Vanderveer," he announced, "and I am taking my wife home. To Pittsburgh." The sky over Pittsburgh was not like the sky over Montana. It was a low, heavy ceiling of sulphurous gray, stained by the ceaseless breath of 1,000 smokestacks. Eliza Vanderveer stood at the window of the private rail car, her hand resting on the velvet curtain. She wore a dress of emerald silk, tailored by her own hand during the long journey east, but her eyes still held the sharpness of a woman who had shot a man to save her husband. "It's ugly," she said softly. "It's power," William replied. He stood behind her, looking at his reflection in the glass. Gideon, the mountain man, was gone. In his place stood William Vanderveer. His hair was sheared close, his beard shaved clean, leaving only the jagged silver scar running down his cheek as a testament to his history. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Phineas Galt's entire bank, tailored to hide the slight limp that still plagued him when it rained. "Are you ready?" Eliza asked, turning to straighten his tie. She didn't flinch at the scar. To her, it was just another map line on the face she loved. "The board meets at noon," William said, his voice cold. "They are voting to dissolve the family trust and sell the foundries to a British conglomerate. They think the Vanderveer line ended in that explosion." "Then let's go introduce them to the ghost." Eliza smiled, a fierce, protective thing. The carriage ride to the Vanderveer steelworks was a blur of cobblestones and soot. When they arrived at the massive iron gates, the guards hesitated. They didn't recognize the man in the carriage. But William simply looked at them, a look of such imperious, familiar authority, that they opened the gates without a word. They walked through the main office building. The clerks stopped typing. The sound of telegraphs fell silent. Whispers rippled through the room like a wind through dry grass. "Is that? It can't be." William didn't stop. He led Eliza straight to the double mahogany doors at the end of the hall. The boardroom. Inside Archibald Crane, the acting chairman raised a glass of brandy. He was a man of soft hands and hard eyes. Around him sat 10 other men in grey suits, the vultures of industry picking over the bones of a dynasty. "To the sale," Crane announced, a smug smile plastered on his face. "And to the memory of the Vanderveers. May they rest in peace, so we may profit in peace." "I'm afraid I can't drink to that," a deep voice boomed. The doors swung open. William stepped in. He didn't shout. He didn't brandish a weapon. He simply walked to the head of the table, pulled out the empty chair that had belonged to his father, and sat down. Eliza stood at his right hand, placing a heavy leather satchel on the table with a decisive thud. The silence in the room was absolute. Crane's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor, spilling amber liquid like blood. "William," Crane whispered, his face draining of color. "But the fire, the reports." "The reports were greatly exaggerated," William said smoothly. He picked up a document from the table, the sale agreement, and read it casually. "Selling the Bessemer patent for pennies on the dollar, Archibald. My father would be disappointed. I am merely furious. You have no standing here." Crane stammered, standing up, trying to regain control. "You were declared legally dead 3 years ago. You are a ghost security." "Sit down," William said. He didn't raise his voice, but the command cracked like a whip. Crane sat. "I have been alive," William continued, gesturing to Eliza, "living in the Montana Territory. My wife, Mrs. Eliza Vanderveer, has kept meticulous records of our life there. And we have a sworn affidavit from a banker in Last Chance, along with the sheriff's report of the assassination attempt you funded 2 weeks ago." A gasp went around the table. The other board members looked at Crane with horror. "Attempt," Crane squeaked. "I don't know what you mean." "The men were named Corcoran and Rourke," Eliza spoke up. Her voice was calm, melodic, but it carried the steel of the mountains. "Mr. Corcoran sang quite a song to the sheriff before he went to the territorial prison. He named you, Mr. Crane. He named the bank accounts used to pay him." She opened the satchel and slid a telegram across the table. It was the confession wired ahead by Sheriff Brady. William leaned forward. The scar on his face caught the gaslight, making him look dangerous, feral. "You tried to kill a mountain man, Archibald. You forgot that the mountain man was born in this room. I survived the fire that took my skin. Did you think a hired gun could finish what hell itself could not?" Crane slumped in his chair, defeated. The other board members began to distance themselves, sliding their chairs away. "I am dissolving this board, effective immediately," William announced. "Security is waiting outside to escort Mr. Crane to the police. The rest of you can submit your resignations by morning." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling factory floor, below the sparks flying, the men working the lifeblood of the city. "We aren't selling," William said to the room. "We are expanding, and we are going to pay the men a fair wage, because I know what it is to be cold. I know what it is to be hungry." He turned back to Eliza. She was smiling at him, a genuine, dazzling smile that cut through the gloom of the office. Later that night, the mansion on the hill was quiet. It was a museum of a house, filled with cold marble and expensive art. William sat on the edge of the massive 4-poster bed, his head in his hands. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving the exhaustion of the journey. Eliza walked in. She had changed into a simple white nightgown. She looked small in the cavernous room, but she moved with the confidence of a queen. "It's done," she said, sitting beside him. "It's just beginning." William sighed. The lawyers, the press, the rebuilding. It will be a war. We've survived blizzards, William. We've survived bears. We've survived gunmen. She took his hand. The rough hand that had chopped wood and skinned deer and kissed the palm. A few lawyers won't scare us. William looked at her. He touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw. I dragged you from a simple life into this madness. Do you hate it? I was a seamstress with debt, William. Now I am the wife of the Steel King. She laughed softly. But I do miss the cabin. We'll keep it, William promised. Every summer, when the heat here gets too much, when the suits get too tight, we go back to Granite Peak, just Gideon and Eliza. Gideon, she whispered, testing the name. I think I like Gideon better. Gideon belongs to you, he said, leaning his forehead against hers. William belongs to the world. But Gideon, he is yours. He kissed her, then a slow, deep kiss that tasted of victory and promise. Outside, the steel mills roared, forging the rails that would bind the nation together. But inside in the quiet dark, the broken mountain man and his seamstress had forged something far stronger than steel. They had forged a life. And that is the story of Eliza and the hidden heir of Granite Peak. From a desperate marriage of convenience in a freezing cabin to the boardrooms of the Industrial Revolution, they proved that love is the only fire that never burns out. It's a reminder that sometimes the person everyone fears is just a soul waiting to be understood, and the quietest person in the room might hold the strength to save you. If this story warmed your heart or kept you on the edge of your seat, please give this video a like. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new romance drama. Share this story with a friend who loves a good plot twist. What did you think of Eliza's bravery in the bank? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.